November 12th, 1993, Seattle Center Coliseum. Kurt Cobain was halfway through Heart-Shaped Box when he heard something that cut through the wall of amplified sound, through 18,000 screaming fans, through his own psychological barriers. The desperate cry of a baby somewhere in the crowd. What happened next would reveal the deepest, most vulnerable part of Kurt's character and show the world that beneath the tortured artist persona lived a soul of pure compassion. This is the story of how a crying infant transformed Kurt Cobain from rock star to guardian angel, and why that moment of tenderness almost destroyed him. Now I'm going to tell you about the night Kurt's hypersensitive heart proved that some sounds are too important to ignore. By November 1993, Kurt Cobain's psychological state had reached a breaking point that few people understood. His hypersensitive nervous system, which made his songwriting so emotionally authentic, also made every aspect of fame feel like psychological torture. The same empathetic nature that allowed him to write lyrics that spoke to millions of troubled souls made him acutely aware of every form of suffering around him. That night in Seattle, his hometown, the place where his musical journey had begun, Kurt was performing in front of a crowd that included childhood friends, family members, and the ghosts of his artistic past. The pressure was overwhelming for someone whose introverted nature made large crowds feel like drowning in an ocean of expectations and emotional demands. Kurt had been struggling with the weight of parenthood since Frances Bean's birth the previous year. Becoming a father had awakened protective instincts in him that were both beautiful and psychologically devastating. Every crying child he encountered triggered his own memories of childhood trauma, his parents' divorce, feelings of abandonment, the years of being misunderstood and emotionally neglected. His relationship with fatherhood was complicated by his own psychological wounds and his fear that his mental illness would somehow damage his daughter. Kurt felt an overwhelming responsibility to protect Frances Bean from the kind of emotional pain he'd experienced, but his own fragile mental state made him question whether he was capable of being the father she deserved. The Seattle show was particularly meaningful because it represented a homecoming for someone who had always felt like an outsider in his own life. These were the people who had known Kurt before fame, before the psychological pressure of being Generation X's reluctant spokesperson, before the weight of success had nearly crushed his sensitive spirit. As Nirvana launched into their set, Kurt's emotional intensity was immediately visible to anyone who understood his psychological patterns. His guitar playing carried extra weight that night, each chord infused with the complex emotions of performing for people who remembered him as a troubled teenager from Aberdeen, not a global rock icon. The crowd of 18,000 was electric with hometown pride and the kind of manic energy that Kurt's hypersensitive nervous system found both energizing and overwhelming. They were singing along to every word, creating a wall of sound that should have drowned out everything else in the venue. But Kurt's artist intuition, honed by years of feeling everything too deeply, was always scanning for details that others missed. During In Bloom, Kurt noticed a young couple in the general admission section who seemed distressed about something. The woman was holding what appeared to be a baby, and even from the stage, Kurt could see that they were dealing with some kind of crisis. His empathetic nature made it impossible to ignore signs of distress even while performing for thousands of people. As they transitioned into Heart-Shaped Box, the song about toxic love and psychological manipulation that had become one of their biggest hits, Kurt's hypersensitive awareness picked up something that would change the entire trajectory of the evening. Through the massive wall of amplified music and crowd noise, he heard the unmistakable sound of an infant in distress. The baby's cry wasn't just fussiness or normal infant irritation. Kurt's finely tuned emotional radar detected genuine distress, the kind of crying that indicated real need rather than simple discomfort. The same sensitivity that made crowds feel overwhelming also gave him an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between different types of human suffering. Kurt continued playing Heart-Shaped Box, but his attention was now divided between his performance and this invisible child whose cries seemed to pierce directly into his soul. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was singing about emotional manipulation and toxic relationships while a helpless infant somewhere in the crowd needed protection and care. As the song progressed, the baby's crying became more desperate, more urgent. Kurt could hear that the infant was not just uncomfortable, but genuinely distressed, possibly in some kind of danger or medical emergency. His paternal instincts, awakened by Frances Bean's birth, made it impossible to continue performing while knowing a child was suffering. Midway through the guitar solo of Heart-Shaped Box, Kurt made a decision that defied every rule of professional performance and revealed the true depths of his character. He stopped playing completely, letting his guitar feedback wail through the amplifiers as he walked to the front of the stage and raised his hand for silence. The sudden absence of Kurt's guitar was jarring. Dave Grohl continued drumming for a few beats before realizing something was wrong, and Chris Novoselic's bass line gradually faded as the band recognized that Kurt had deliberately stopped the song. 18,000 people fell into confused silence, uncertain whether this was part of the performance or evidence of another Kurt Cobain psychological episode. "Hold on," Kurt said into his microphone, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised everyone who heard it. "There's a baby somewhere in here who needs help. I can hear crying, and it sounds like real distress, not just normal baby stuff." The crowd began murmuring, some people looking around to locate the source of the crying that Kurt had somehow detected through the overwhelming noise. Others assumed this was another example of Kurt's hypersensitive nature creating problems where none existed. But Kurt's conviction was absolute, knew what he'd heard, and he couldn't continue performing while a child was in distress. "I know this might sound weird," Kurt continued, his voice now carrying the vulnerability that made his music so emotionally powerful, "but I can't keep singing while someone's baby is crying like that. It's, it's not a sound I can ignore. Will whoever has the baby please raise your hand so we can help?" The request revealed everything about Kurt's character, his empathetic nature, his protective instincts, his inability to prioritize entertainment over human welfare, and his willingness to risk professional embarrassment to help someone in need. For several moments, nothing happened. The arena remained in uncomfortable silence as security personnel and audience members tried to locate the source of crying that Kurt insisted he could hear. Some people in the crowd were beginning to mutter about delays and disrupted performances, but Kurt remained focused at the front of the stage, scanning the audience with the intensity of someone whose life depended on finding this child. Then, from the general admissions section, about 60 rows back from the stage, a young woman's hand went up tentatively. She was holding a small bundle, and even from the stage, it was clear that she was dealing with some kind of crisis. Security personnel immediately began making their way toward her location, guided by Kurt's pointing and the crowd's cooperation. As the story emerged over the next few minutes, it became clear that Kurt's hypersensitive awareness had detected a genuine emergency. The young woman, later identified as 19-year-old Maria Santos from Tacoma, had brought her 3-month-old daughter to the concert because she had no childcare and couldn't afford to miss the show she'd saved months to attend. But the baby, Isabella, had developed what appeared to be a severe fever during the performance. Maria was a single mother with limited medical knowledge and no money for emergency room visits. She'd been trying to calm her increasingly distressed infant while debating whether to leave the concert and seek medical help she couldn't afford. The baby's crying had intensified as her condition worsened, but in the chaos of a rock concert, nobody around Maria had realized the severity of the situation. It took Kurt Cobain's hypersensitive hearing and empathetic nature to detect the difference between normal infant fussiness and genuine medical distress from hundreds of feet away. When security reached Maria and confirmed the situation, Kurt made another decision that shocked everyone present. Instead of simply ensuring that medical help was called and continuing with the show, he jumped down from the stage and began making his way through the crowd toward the young mother and her sick child. Kurt's decision to leave the stage and enter the crowd was unprecedented in rock concert history, but it was completely consistent with his character, a man whose hypersensitive nature made it impossible to ignore suffering once he'd identified it. The crowd parted for him like water, creating a path through the sea of humanity as their rock hero transformed into something much more important, a caring human being responding to a child in need. When Kurt reached Maria and baby Isabella, his transformation from performer to caregiver was immediate and complete. All traces of stage persona disappeared as he focused entirely on the sick infant and her frightened teenage mother. The same sensitivity that made fame unbearable now became a superpower of human connection and protective instinct. "Hey, sweetheart," Kurt said softly to Maria, his voice carrying none of the edge or irony of his stage persona. "What's happening with your little one? How long has she been like this?" Maria was overwhelmed by the surreal experience of having Kurt Cobain personally attending to her emergency, but Kurt's genuine concern and obvious knowledge about infant care helped her focus on the medical situation. "She started getting really hot about an hour ago," Maria explained through tears. "I don't know what to do. I can't afford a doctor, and I was scared to leave because of the ticket." Kurt immediately took charge of the situation with a competence that surprised everyone present. Few people knew that Kurt had educated himself extensively about infant care after Frances Bean's birth, driven by his determination to be a better father than his own had been. His research had been obsessive and thorough, motivated by love and anxiety in equal measure. "She's running a high fever," Kurt said, after gently touching Isabella's forehead. "This needs medical attention right now. We're getting you to a hospital, and don't worry about money. I'll take care of everything." The promise wasn't just celebrity generosity, it was the protective instinct of someone whose own childhood had been marked by financial insecurity and inadequate care. Kurt understood what it meant to need help that wasn't available, and his success had given him the resources to ensure that no child would suffer the way he had. What happened next transformed a rock concert into a humanitarian mission. Kurt personally escorted Maria and Isabella out of the venue, using his celebrity status to expedite medical care. For the next 4 hours, while his bandmates dealt with 18,000 disappointed fans, Kurt Cobain sat in a Seattle emergency room holding a stranger's baby and providing emotional support to a frightened teenage mother. Isabella was diagnosed with a severe ear infection that could have led to dangerous complications if left untreated. Kurt's intervention had likely prevented a much more serious medical crisis. His hypersensitive awareness had literally helped save a child's life. But Kurt's care extended far beyond that single night. He quietly established a trust fund for Isabella's education and healthcare needs. When he discovered that Maria had dropped out of high school, he arranged for tutoring and childcare so she could complete her education. "Kurt saved my baby's life, but he also saved mine," Maria reflected years later. "He gave us a future. He made sure Isabella would have opportunities I never could have provided." For Kurt, caring for Maria and Isabella revealed that his hypersensitive nature could be a powerful force for good when directed toward protecting vulnerable people. The incident satisfied his deep need to feel valuable as a human being rather than just as an entertainer. "That night changed how I think about my sensitivity," Kurt told his therapist. "I always saw it as weakness, but Isabella needed someone who could hear what others couldn't. Maybe being hypersensitive isn't a flaw. Maybe it's a responsibility." The experience also triggered deeper reflections about his own childhood trauma. Holding Isabella reminded Kurt of his own desperate need for protection during his parents' divorce, when he felt abandoned and emotionally neglected. In caring for this vulnerable infant, Kurt was perhaps caring for the wounded child within himself, offering the immediate, unconditional protection he had craved as a boy. His bandmates noticed the profound change in Kurt after the Isabella incident. He started talking about using his platform for more than just music, Dave Grohl recalled. Kurt realized his sensitivity wasn't a curse, but a gift that came with responsibility to help others who were suffering in silence. The story became legendary in music circles, though Kurt kept it private. Maria Santos became a pediatric nurse inspired by watching Kurt's gentle care. Isabella carries Kurt's middle name as tribute to the man who helped save her life. The trust fund Kurt established not only paid for Isabella's education, but also funded a scholarship program for children of single mothers. His single act of compassion created ripples of assistance that have helped hundreds of families over the decades since. The story reveals the man behind the tortured artist persona, someone whose hypersensitivity wasn't a character flaw but a gift that enabled extraordinary compassion. His ability to hear one crying baby among 18,000 screaming fans was a manifestation of a soul so attuned to suffering that ignoring it was impossible. Kurt's willingness to abandon a concert and spend hours caring for a stranger's child shows the depth of character that his music only hinted at. The same traits that made fame unbearable, his empathy, his hypersensitive awareness, were also what made him capable of genuine heroism. Kurt Cobain heard a crying baby and chose love over performance, human connection over professional obligation. In doing so, he saved more than Isabella's life. He revealed the beautiful broken heart that made his music matter and his loss so devastating.